The old man in the red jacket barely looked up when the biker's shadow fell across his table. The bar went silent. Every eye in the place locked on the confrontation. The biker, 6'4" and covered in leather and chains, slammed his palm on the scarred wood. "This is my spot, old man. Move." The veteran with the white beard and sad eyes just kept his gaze on his water glass, his weathered hands steady. I said, "Move." The biker's voice rose, drawing nods from his crew near the pool tables, but the old man in the red jacket didn't flinch, didn't speak, just sat there like he'd seen worse things than an angry man in a bar. What happened next would leave everyone in that room speechless. His name was Thomas Garrett, and if you'd seen him shuffling into Murphy's bar that Tuesday evening, you wouldn't have given him a second glance. 70 years old, white hair and beard that needed a trim, wearing that same faded red jacket over a plain shirt he'd worn for years. His face carried the kind of sadness that doesn't wash off, the kind that settles into the lines around your eyes and never leaves. He'd been coming to Murphy's for 3 years now, always alone, always ordering water, always sitting at the corner table near the back. The regulars knew him as the quiet guy who never caused trouble. They didn't know that 45 years ago, Thomas Garrett had been Captain Thomas Garrett, and that the things he'd done in the jungles of Vietnam had earned him medals he kept in a shoebox under his bed because looking at them hurt too much. The biker gang had rolled into town that afternoon, 10 Harleys rumbling down Main Street like thunder. They called themselves the Iron Reapers, and they had a reputation 3 counties wide for taking what they wanted. Their leader, a man named Vic Bronson, had done time for assault. He wore his criminal record like a badge of honour. When they pushed through Murphy's doors at 7 p.m, the bartender, a young guy named Danny, felt his stomach drop. But this was a public establishment, and he couldn't turn them away. They took over the pool tables, ordered rounds of whiskey, got loud. Danny kept his head down and poured their drinks. Thomas had arrived at his usual time, 6:30, taking his usual seat. He'd nodded to Danny, received his water, and settled in to watch the evening news on the TV mounted in the corner. He didn't pay much attention when the bikers arrived. He'd learned long ago that the best way to avoid trouble was to become invisible. But Vic Bronson had other ideas. After his 4th whiskey, Vic decided he wanted that corner table. Maybe it was the angle, maybe it was the proximity to the restroom, maybe it was just because he could. He swaggered over, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and that's when he delivered his demand. "This is my spot, old man. Move." Thomas looked up slowly. His eyes, pale blue and tired, met Vic's for just a moment. Then he looked back down at his water. "I've been sitting here," he said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every person in that bar heard it in the sudden silence. Vic's face reddened. "You think I care? You think because you're old I won't drag you out of that chair?" Thomas's hands remained steady on the table. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "Just want to finish my water in peace." One of Vic's crew laughed, a harsh sound. The old man thinks he can stand up to Vic. This is gonna be good. Danny the bartender reached for his phone under the bar. His hands were shaking. He'd already dialed 911 when Vic grabbed Thomas's water glass and threw it against the wall. It shattered, water streaming down the faded wallpaper. "Now you got nothing to finish," Vic snarled. "Get up and get out, or I'll put you through that wall next." Thomas stood, but not the way Vic expected. He didn't scramble or cower. He rose slowly with a kind of deliberate movement that spoke of old discipline, old training. He was shorter than Vic by half a foot, thinner by 50 pounds, but something in the way he stood made Vic take an involuntary step back. "You don't want to do this," Thomas said. His voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something that made the hair on Danny's neck stand up. Vic recovered his bravado quickly. "Old man, I've broken bigger guys than you for breakfast." Thomas didn't respond. He just stood there, hands at his sides, that sad, serious expression never changing. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Vic's crew started moving closer, forming a semicircle. This was going to get ugly. Danny finished dialing and whispered urgently into the phone. "We need police at Murphy's bar right now. There's going to be a fight." But before Vic could make his move, the door to the bar opened. A man in a police uniform stepped inside, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came another figure, and when the people in that bar saw who it was, several of them gasped. Colonel James Mitchell, United States Marine Corps, retired, walked into Murphy's bar in full dress uniform. He was 72 years old, ramrod straight, chest covered in ribbons and medals. He'd been the chief of police in this town for 15 years before retiring, and everyone knew him. Everyone respected him. What they didn't know was why he was here, why he was in uniform, why his face looked like he'd just heard the most important news of his life. The young officer, a rookie named Peters, had been the one to take Danny's call. When he'd heard the address, heard that there was an old vet in a red jacket about to get beaten up by bikers, he'd made a decision that probably saved his career. He'd called Colonel Mitchell. "Sir," Peters had said, "there's a situation at Murphy's. Old veteran, white beard, red jacket, looks about 70. Mitchell had gone silent on the other end of the line. Then he'd said 3 words that made Peters' blood run cold. "I'll be there." When Peters had arrived at Mitchell's house to pick him up, the colonel was already in his dress blues, and there were tears in his eyes. Vic Bronson turned when the door opened, ready to tell whoever it was to mind their own business. But the words died in his throat when he saw Colonel Mitchell. The colonel's eyes swept the room, taking in the broken glass, the threatening stance of the bikers, and finally landing on Thomas Garrett standing by that corner table. The colonel's face transformed. 50 years seemed to fall away. He crossed the room in 5 long strides, and then, in front of everyone, Colonel James Mitchell came to attention and saluted. "Captain Garrett, sir," he said, his voice breaking. "It's been too long." The bar erupted in confused whispers. "Captain? That old guy?" Thomas returned the salute slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, the people at Murphy's bar saw him smile. It was a sad smile, but it was real. "Jimmy Mitchell," Thomas said. "Last time I saw you, you were a scared private who'd just landed in Da Nang." Mitchell's eyes were wet now. "And you were the captain who saved my life, sir. Twice. Once when you pulled me out of that river under fire, and once when you talked me down from eating my rifle after we lost Patterson and crew. You gave me a reason to keep going. You told me I had a future worth living for." The colonel turned to face the room, and his voice carried the authority of 4 decades of service. "This man," he said, pointing at Thomas, "is Captain Thomas Garrett. He served 3 tours in Vietnam. He has 2 silver stars, a bronze star with V device, and a Purple Heart. He led a platoon through some of the worst fighting of the war and brought more of his men home alive than any other officer in the battalion. When he was wounded in 72, he refused evacuation until every single one of his men was accounted for. He carried 2 wounded soldiers half a mile through enemy territory with a piece of shrapnel in his leg. This man is a hero." Vic Bronson had gone pale. His crew had backed up, suddenly very interested in the floor. The colonel wasn't finished. After the war, Mitchell continued, Captain Garrett came home to nothing. His wife had left, his parents had passed, and the country he'd bled for treated him like garbage. He struggled with what we now call PTSD for years. He lost jobs, lost homes, lost hope. But he never lost his dignity. He never raised his hand in anger. He never became the monster that war could have made him. He chose peace. He chose quiet. He chose to live with his pain rather than spread it to others. Thomas stood there, and for the first time, people saw past the sad old man in the red jacket. They saw the straight back, the steady hands, the eyes that had seen things they couldn't imagine. Danny the bartender felt ashamed that he'd never asked, never wondered, never looked deeper. Colonel Mitchell turned to Vic. "Now," the colonel said, his voice dropping to something dangerous, "you are about to do what exactly to this man?" Vic couldn't meet his eyes. "I didn't know," he mumbled. The colonel stepped closer. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You saw an old man and assumed weakness. You saw someone who wouldn't fight back and decided that made him prey. That makes you a coward and a bully." Officer Peters stepped forward. "We can arrest them for assault, sir. The glass, the threats. We have witnesses." But Thomas raised his hand. "No," he said quietly. "They didn't hurt me. They were just being foolish. Let them go." Vic looked up, shocked. "You're letting us walk?" Thomas met his gaze. "I spent 3 years watching young men die," he said. "I spent 40 years after that trying to figure out why I lived when they didn't. I'm not going to add to the violence in this world if I don't have to, but I will tell you this. Respect isn't something you take, it's something you earn, and you don't earn it by threatening old men in bars." The colonel nodded slowly. "Captain's right." But Vic, if I hear about you or your crew causing trouble in this town, if I hear about you so much as jaywalking, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you face every consequence the law allows. Do we understand each other?" Vic nodded rapidly. "Yes, sir." His crew was already heading for the door. They left their bikes running in their haste to get out of town. The sound of the Harleys faded into the distance, and Murphy's bar let out a collective breath. Danny came around from behind the bar carrying a fresh glass of water. He set it in front of Thomas with shaking hands. "On the house, sir," he said. "Always. I'm sorry I never asked." "I'm sorry I didn't know." Thomas patted his arm gently. "You didn't need to know, son. I'm just a customer." But Danny shook his head. "No, sir, you're a hero, and from now on, everyone in this town is going to know it." The other patrons in the bar had gathered closer now, their fear replaced by curiosity and respect. One older man, a regular named Frank, stepped forward. "I served in 73, he said. "Army. I never saw combat like you did, but I know what it cost. Thank you for your service, Captain." Colonel Mitchell stayed for an hour, sitting with Thomas at that corner table, talking about old times, about the men they'd served with, about the years since. Mitchell told him about his career, his family, his grandchildren. Thomas listened with that same sad smile, and Mitchell realized that his old captain was lonely, had been lonely for a very long time. Before he left, Mitchell wrote his personal number on a napkin. "You call me," he said. "Sunday dinner's at my house. My wife makes a roast that'll remind you there's still good things in this world. Your family, Captain. You always were." After Mitchell left, the atmosphere in Murphy's bar had changed forever. People approached Thomas carefully, respectfully, thanking him, asking if they could buy him dinner, asking to hear his stories. He declined most of it, uncomfortable with the attention, but he accepted their thanks with quiet grace. Danny made an announcement that Thomas's water would always be free, and that corner table was his, reserved, no questions asked. A small brass plaque appeared on the table 3 days later, reserved for Captain Thomas Garrett, American hero. Word spread through the small town like wildfire. The local newspaper ran a story. The VFW Post invited Thomas to speak, and though he declined, he did start attending their monthly breakfasts. People who'd passed him on the street for years without a second glance now stopped to shake his hand, to thank him, to see him. The red jacket became a symbol around town. Kids learned about Captain Garrett in school. The high school history teacher brought her class to meet him, and Thomas, who'd been silent for so long, found himself telling stories he'd buried for decades. He told them about the fear, yes, but also about the brotherhood, about the men who'd become closer than family in the worst circumstances imaginable, about the translator who'd saved their lives and who Thomas had spent 10 years trying to bring to America, finally succeeding in 82, about the village elder who'd hidden them from enemy patrols and who Thomas still sent money to every Christmas, about the medic who'd sung Elvis songs while patching up wounded men under fire, about the young private who'd died in Thomas's arms asking if he'd done good, if he'd made his mother proud. Thomas had told him yes, had held him and told him yes until the light left his eyes. The stories weren't all sad. There were moments of unexpected beauty, sunrises over rice paddies that took your breath away, a mama-san who'd shared her family's dinner with hungry soldiers, the time the whole platoon had pooled their money to buy a water buffalo for a farmer whose animal had been killed in crossfire. Small acts of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. These were the things Thomas shared, and in sharing them, something in him began to heal. The sadness didn't leave his eyes, but it was joined by something else now. Purpose, connection, the knowledge that his story mattered. Vic Bronson never came back to town, but 6 months later, a letter arrived at Murphy's bar addressed to Captain Thomas Garrett. Danny brought it to Thomas at his usual table. Inside was a short note written in a rough handwriting. "Captain Garrett," it read. "I was the fool in the bar. I've thought about that night every day since. You could have had me arrested. You could have let your friend destroy me. You didn't. You showed me mercy I didn't deserve. I've been thinking about what you said about respect and earning it. I've been thinking about a lot of things. I'm in therapy now, trying to be better, trying to earn the respect I tried to take. Thank you for the lesson. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being a better man than me. Respectfully, Vic Bronson." Thomas read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Danny watched him. "That's something," he said. Thomas nodded. "People can change," he said. If they want to, if they're willing to do the work. I've seen the worst of humanity, Danny, but I've also seen the best. Sometimes they're in the same person, just at different times. We all have the capacity for both. The choice is ours. On a sunny Tuesday morning, 2 years after that night at Murphy's bar, Thomas Garrett sat at his corner table reading the newspaper. His water glass was full, the brass plaque gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window, and around him, the bar was filled with people who knew his name, knew his story, and treated him with the respect he'd never asked for but had always deserved. Colonel Mitchell stopped by every Sunday to pick him up for dinner. The VFW had made him an honorary member. The high school had named their new scholarship after him. But more than any of that, Thomas Garrett was no longer invisible. He was seen, he was known, he was home.